Okay, here is question number 12 from page 92 in section 2.4. This is another one of the counting problems on the number of items in a set. This is a turn-in problem. This one's a little bit trickier than some of the others we've done. It's a little different because if you read the question, we have in a survey of 100 investors, it was found that the first line says 5 owned utilities stock only. That's different from any of the other problems we've done up to this point. So, in fact, I'm just going to highlight that whole line right there. 5 owned utility stock only. That tells me on utilities, just utilities, I need to put a 5 in there. So I don't necessarily have to start in the middle, although I probably will come back and start in the continue from the middle and work my way out, except for these couple of special cases. Utilities only, so put a 5 in there. Now, the next line is very similar. I have 15 owned transportation stock only. So in transportation, I'll put that in green. This green is just about out of ink there. Transportation only. In that green portion, 15 people. Because that's all they owned, just transportation. Now I'm going to go from the bottom up. So I have 3 people owned all 3 kinds. This will be the portion in the middle where all 3 intersect. And in that yellow area, I'll put 3. 3 people owned all 3 kinds. From there, 10 people owned utilities, stock, and bonds. So the portion for utilities and bonds is this little part. Well, it includes the 3 who owned all 3 because they owned utilities and bonds. For the part that's just utilities and bonds, I will need to subtract. 10 minus 3 gives me 7. 7 people owned utilities and bonds, but not transportation stock. So we have that one. I'm going to kind of highlight them as I take care of that line and figuring this problem. On the next line, from the bottom, 23 owned transportation stock and bonds. So transportation and bonds, so that's the intersection of this circle that has a little green in it and the bond circle. Now, from that 23, 3 people are already counted. The 3 people who owned all 3 owned transportation, stock, and bonds. So I'm going to need to subtract. 23 minus 3 gives me 20 people owned just transportation, stock, and bonds, and not utilities. So we got that taken care of. The next line up, 13 people owned utilities and transportation stock. So utilities and transportation, the intersection of these 2 circles, and that's going to be this region, plus the 3 who owned everything because they owned utilities and transportation stock. So I'm going to have to subtract. 13 minus 3 gives me 10. 10 people owned utilities and transportation stock, but not bonds. So we got that taken care of. I have one more to take a look at as far as the inside part of this picture goes. 70 people owned bonds. Now inside the bond circle, we already have several people counted in there. I got the 3 who had all 3, the 7 who had utilities and bonds without transportation. I got 20 people who had transportation and bonds and not utilities. So we need to add 20 plus 3 plus 7. And if you add those three numbers, you'll get 30. 30 people from the 70 are already counted, so I'm going to have to subtract. 70 minus 30 will give me 40. 40 people owned just bonds. So I have the 70 owned bonds counted for in my picture. And let's see, at the top it says, in a survey of 100 investors, it was found that, so the total is 100. In the universal set, there's 100 people. So what I will need to do is add the numbers that are inside the circles and then subtract that sum from 100. So I'm going to start in the utility circle. 5 plus 10 plus 7 plus 3. And then transportation, the 15 plus 20. Be careful not to add any numbers in there twice. The last number I need is the 40 who had bonds only. When I add up all the numbers I have inside the circles, well, I get 100. That means of the people surveyed, they all fit somewhere in the three circles on the Venn diagram. So there were 0 people who didn't have any of the three. Now let me go to the questions that they posed in the book. Part A, how many investors owned bonds only? Well, that would be 40. 40 people, bonds only, that's the number right here in my Venn diagram, bonds only without the others. For part B, how many investors owned utilities and or transportation stock? So I could have, with the and or, anybody in utilities and anybody in transportation. Be careful not to count people twice. I'm going to write this out on here. Okay, I have the 5 who owned just utilities. Well, they owned utilities. I have the 7 who owned utilities and bonds. So they owned utilities. I have the 3 who owned all 3. I have the 10 people who owned utilities and transportation without bonds. I have 15 people who owned transportation only. And then we have 20 people who owned transportation and bonds, not utilities, but they had transportation. So if you add these numbers together that I've written in this little list, 5 plus 7 plus 3 plus 10 plus 15 plus 20, and I get 60. So 60 people owned utilities and or transportation stock. In fact, there's only one group not counted in there. That's the ones who had bonds only. So maybe I could have just subtracted that from 100. Maybe you noticed that and maybe you didn't. But at any rate, I worked it directly by adding up the numbers as I pulled them from the Venn diagram. For part C, how many investors owned neither bonds nor utilities? So not bonds and not utilities. Oh, this is going to be one of those we talked about in class that might be a little hard to interpret. I have to say it again for myself. How many investors owned not bonds and not utilities?